What's up? I'm travel photographer Brendan Vanson of brendansadventures.com, and today I'm going to give you an introduction to photography, showing you the basics using Microsoft Paint, which I'm sure is a terrible idea. Let's do it anyway.
Okay, so it's been ages since I got into photography, and sometimes I forget about the basics. I forget how far I've come and how nice it was to hear a simplified version of the basics of photography. Lots of people jump on, grab a camera, start shooting it on auto, and they don't know exactly how it's working or why it's working. So I thought I'd bring you back to the basics, and I would do it using Microsoft Paint, because it's kind of funny. I'm absolute shit at drawing things. So in my crazy boggled mind, after a 26-hour train ride here in China today, I thought it would be funny to give you the basics of photography through Microsoft Paint, because why not? Anyways, let's get started. I'm going to show you basically the basic functions, and I'm saying the word basic way too much, of how the camera works, and then I'm going to go into how it gathers light and creates a photo. So going onto my screen here, which is a touch screen, and you're not allowed to make fun of how I draw. That's the number one rule to this. So what happens when we have a camera is, this is our camera. It's beautiful, as you can see. Now, the camera basically just gathers its light through the lens, which is awesome. That's probably the fanciest of Canon lenses. And you have a sensor back here. And this is actually what does all the work. This is what reads the light, and it's what develops our digital image in the end. But to get there, it has to go through a number of things. So you've got your lens here, and then you've also got your shutter here. And and basically those are two controlling elements to how much light is gathered by the sensor. Now, if you're shooting a DSLR, you've got a mirror here, and the mirror basically bounces the light that's coming through here up here to another mirror that goes to the viewfinder. And so you don't actually see what the sensor sees. You see a reflection through the mirror system out of the lens. And so what happens basically, once you press the shutter button of the camera, this mirror flops up, the shutter lifts up or opens and closes as quick as you decide based on your shutter speed, and you allow the light to hit the sensor for a certain amount of time, creating your image. If you're shooting like a non-DSLR, like a mirrorless camera, it's all the same basics, except you don't have a mirror here. There's no mirror. So your camera basically just reads the digital idea of the image on the back right away. So if you're a mirrorless camera shooter, that's why you see the image on the back of the screen on the LCD. Some of them don't have a viewfinder. Some of them have a viewfinder up here, and it just shows you a digital image. So it's not actually looking through the lens. It's giving you a digital reading. And that's the basics of how your camera work, a completely simplified version of photography. It is simple, simple, simple stuff. Now, I want to get into how a camera gathers light. And basically, that decide on how much light is gathered by your sensor. If you didn't have these controlling elements to gather light, you would just get either a white blob or a black blob. Your camera would have no idea how to read how much light it should be reading to get a properly exposed image. So we have our first thing, which is ISO, which is our light sensitivity on the film. And then our second thing is our shutter speed. Shutter speed. I'm running out of room. Shutter speed. Not allowed to make fun of my writing either. Touch screen. And our final thing is our aperture. So our aperture. And that's also known as the f-stop. Right there. Boom. So we've got that. And so ISO is the light sensitivity. Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open, and aperture is how big the hole in the lens is to allow the light. I'll get into these details after I clear the screen. So getting to the first one, to ISO. ISO is kind of like in an old camera, you had to choose how sensitive the film was before you shot. When you put the roll of film in the camera, you had to choose an ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, whatever you wanted. And the quality was generally way better the lower the ISO. So when you're shooting an ISO 100, which is, that's probably the cleanest image, you get a nice glossy image. so your photo doesn't have what we call noise or grain in it. So I'm going to shoot an ISO 100 image here, and I'll show you zoomed in, there's no grain or very little grain. Now, if we shoot an ISO like 800 image, you start seeing a lot of grain, and that's because the film is more sensitive, where the digital film in our DSLR cameras is more sensitive to light. So it basically allows you to shoot darker scenes with faster shutter speeds or wider apertures, anything like that. But instead of getting really sharp, clean images, you're going to start getting a bunch of grain. So you're going to get like pockets of dotty grain all over your image. And a lot of photographers hate the grain. The noise is a no-no. It's one of the technical flaws of photography. For some types of images, you need the grain. And for other types of images, there's no way to get an image without higher ISO. So the way I like to look at it actually is kind of like in terms of sandpaper. If you use a really fine sandpaper, you're going to get really smooth surface, but it's going to take you a long time to get that. If you use a really hard, thick sandpaper, you're going to get like a nice a very rough surface, but you're going to be able to do it quickly. So with low ISOs like 100, you're going to get a nice smooth image, but you got to have slower shutter speeds. And with higher ISO, you're going to have more grainy image, a less clean image, but you're going to have, but you're going to be able to shoot much quicker. Okay, let me clear this now. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. God help me. I'll just move myself over here. Pretend that didn't happen. Okay, so to get into shutter speed is simple. Shutter speed is the speed that your shutter is open. There's nothing really more to say about it. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, your shutter's round, but for simplicity, let's pretend it's a gate like this. And with your gate, where is my paintbrush? Sorry. With your gate, it's got to be open for a certain amount of time, so it might be like 1/100 seconds. So that's a quick shutter, open and close. If you want to start doing some fun stuff, some long exposure stuff, most DSLRs automatically go up to 30 seconds. And if you're shooting 30 seconds, it's going to be gathering light for that time. Of course, if you're shooting in the broad daylight, your image is going to turn out like this. It's just going to be white because you're gathering too much light. But if you're shooting a dark scene at night, what you're going to get is you're going to get your cool scene, you're going to get dark, and you'll get things like, if there's a highway here, you'll get the light trails coming down and across and stuff like that, because it's picking up the light as it's moving all the way across the screen and saving it. So that's the cool thing about working out your shutter speeds. Generally, if you're shooting handheld, you want to go like 1 over whatever your focal length is. So if you're shooting a 50mm camera, the lowest you want to handhold is 1/50 seconds, or else put your camera onto a tripod. If you're shooting a long lens 200mm, then 1/200 is probably your limit for handheld. Now, aperture is a fun one. Aperture basically is the hole in your lens. So obviously, the bigger hole you have, the more light gets in. So if you're shooting like, I'm shooting these images that I'm showing you on a 50mm Canon f1.8. You're shooting a 1.8, and the circle, the hole might look like this. And then if you move it to 9, it might look like this. You're shooting 16, it might look like that. So obviously, the smaller hole, the less light gets in. And it has all sorts of different results based on that. So, for example, if you're shooting f1.8, like this image is, you're shooting 1.8, what happens is you've got this is your camera here. And since the hole is bigger, the sensor's reading like this. And you're getting a nice, wide lot of light, but it doesn't focus very well. So, as a result, you get a low, what they call depth of field. And depth of field is the distance that the image is in focus. So, for example, if you're shooting f1.8, your depth of field on a 50mm might only be 5 centimeters, where it's in focus, and then you've got a nice blurry background, what they call a bokeh. So, depth of field is created based on your aperture, based on your f-stop. If you're shooting 1.8, very little of this scene is going to be in focus. If you go all the way to the other extreme and you shoot f16, your hole is smaller, and so your depth of field is also way longer. So you might get like this massive distance in focus. And honestly, from here you might be shooting anything after maybe like 30 centimeters to infinity will be in focus. That's not the infinity sign. All of that might be in focus. And so if you're shooting f16, you get a lot in focus. If you're shooting f1.8, very little is in focus. Both have their reasons. Now, when you put all of it together, you realize that photography and gathering light is essentially like a math formula. And you've got to put your ISO and your shutter speed and your aperture all together to create a proper exposure. And you can manipulate certain things to make your camera do other things to make the picture look a certain way. So if you shoot ISO 100 at f5.6 and your shutter speed is 1/1000, and you realize you want more in focus, all you do is drop this down to 11, and then your shutter speed becomes 1/500 or something like that. So it's just basically a giant math formula. And the beauty of digital cameras these days and the technology we use is most of the formula is done for us based on our meters. And the rest is just up to our art. It depends on how we want to do it. If we want a really, really sharp photo of something small that has a very small depth of field, then we manipulate the system. We manipulate our numbers of our ISO, our shutter speed, and our aperture to make that happen. Same thing happens with long exposures. If you want a long exposure of a street, for example, in the early evening, you manipulate the system to make it work. You drop everything down to make your shutter speed longer, low ISO, really narrow wide depth of field, so something like f16, f11, and then your longer shutter speed matches it so you get a properly exposed photo. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're shooting inside a building and of a rock concert that's quite dark or something like that, and you need to gather more light, you can do things like you open up your aperture to f2.8 or something like that, and then you increase your ISO to allow you to shoot a shutter speed that captures the action in the low light. So in essence, it's much simpler than people think, but it is complicated and it's hard to get this stuff figured out. But after a couple weeks practicing with it, you'll figure it out. The biggest thing I stress is you can't be shooting on auto. If you want to learn these things and you want to learn how to manipulate certain things for certain photos, you need to be shooting in manual mode to do that. You really need to practice manipulating every single aspect from ISO to shutter speed to the aperture. And that's it. That is the basics of photography. That is the essence of gathering light in a simplified Microsoft Paint version. And who knows, I might come back and do some more Microsoft Paint stuff in the future. For now, all I want to do is urge you to subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to head over to brendansadventures.com. If you head over there, and check out the sidebar. On the sidebar, there is a sign-up form for my newsletter. When you sign up for my newsletter, you get a free copy of my adventure travel magazine, Vagabundo magazine, which is badass. I promise you, there's tons of great travel photography stuff in there if you're into that sort of thing. And yeah, stay tuned to the channel. There's lots of cool stuff coming up. I'm in China. I'm in the north of China, headed to Mongolia next, so stay tuned for some cool stuff from here. I'll catch you next time. Peace.